Good morning. Welcome to all our audience here and online, at home, office, wherever you are. We are here for our session, Human Nutrition on a Finite Planet, Securing Sustainable and Healthy Diets for All. Then I think it's my pleasure to introduce the first speaker. If Johan can't do it, Francesco, that will be you. Francesco Branca, he's director at World Health Organization. Someone that has dedicated, I don't know if most of your life, Francesco, but a big part of his life to human nutrition and to human health, and a great contributor to the discussions in this area. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sandra, for the introduction, and good morning to all, or good day if you're watching from another time zone. And thank you very much for this wonderful consortium of European agencies that have put together this very important conference. I'm asked to play the health part, being at the World Health Organization, so that's what you expect from me. But I really would like to start in the spirit of this One Health conference to tell you that the interactions between food system and health really follow multiple pathways. One of them is, of course, unhealthy diet, malnutrition, food insecurity, and we're discussing this a lot these days. The second one is the safety of food. The third one is what you heard also yesterday about the impact that the way food is produced has, for example, on the transmission of zoonosis, or also on the lack of effect of antimicrobials if we overuse them. But then there is an impact on human health through the environment, as well as an impact on human health through the health of workers in the food system. So today, really, in my talk, I will be focusing on one of these pathways, and that is the unhealthy diet and the malnutrition. And we're able to quantify this impact by looking at burden of disease. This is an institute in the state of Washington in the United States that produces this very nice introductive platform. You can update it every time. So that's why sometimes you see these numbers which are slightly different, because they get continuously updated from the estimates. And these are the factors that are leading to the burden of disease, or the factors responsible for death and disability. What I'm showing you is the graph about death, and you can see there that unhealthy diet is responsible for at least 8 million deaths every year, largely from cardiovascular disease, the cancer, and diabetes. But on top of that, you also have the deaths that are accounted for by high body mass index, by obesity, as well as the deaths are accounted for by maternal and child malnutrition, including inadequate breastfeeding. So if you put them together, that's actually quite a lot. It's about 1/3 of the global burden of disease. It would come on top of all the other cases, more than tobacco or air pollution, although they are, very important element there. So we're really dealing with something which is so important. And focusing on healthy diet, I'd like to start with the concept. So WHO has defined this concept. Actually, probably we realize we need to do it even better, and I commit to actually do it later this year. But the concept is healthy diet, first of all, is promoting human health. This is about children's growth and development. But then it's also about prevention of different disease conditions, malnutrition in all its forms. And you know that in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, we talk about undernutrition, macronutrient deficiencies, and obesity. And then, of course, the diet-related chronic diseases. I was hoping that Marta Hugas would be here, because she also contributed to developing a concept of healthy diet, which was used in the context of last year's UN Food System Summit. And you see it's a very similar concept. A healthy diet is health promoting and disease preventing, provides adequacy without excess of nutrients and health promoting substances from nutrition foods, and avoid the consumption of health harming substances. So she also added there the importance of having adequacy of nutrient intake, not too little, not too much. And then, of course, the safety of foods. Now, I'd like to articulate a bit the concept of healthy diet. And before I do that, I have to say that clearly a healthy diet starts immediately at birth. And the best food that a human being can have at birth is their mother's breast milk. So when we talk about healthy diet, we always have to put this concept, of breastfeeding. WHO recommend that babies are exclusively breastfed, means without anything else, without any water, without any additional complements or whatsoever, for the first 6 months of life, and continuously breastfed until 2 years and beyond, with a lot of good consequences for the growth, for the prevention of infectious diseases, even for the long-term development, IQ, prevention of obesity, and so forth. But now, if we want to take the burden of disease approach, we can try to somehow disarticulate and explain the details of the elements that constitute a healthy diet. Again, looking at the burden of disease, we see that there are some elements which are consumed in excess, and some elements which are consumed in an insufficient amount. So I've put those marks indicating high temperature next to the elements that are consumed in excess, and marked with a low temperature sign the elements that are consumed in an insufficient way. So this is not only about, we are exceeding. There's also a number of things which we don't have enough in our diet. So that will sort of help us as a guide to see what we're talking about. And you see there sodium, certain fats, red meats, they are in sugars, they are in the sort of excess part, and a lot of others, including fruit, vegetables, wholemeal cereals, legumes, unsaturated fat, they are in the low part. So I'll start with salt, which is really the top one, really the main factor responsible for the high burden of disease. And I'll basically walk you through the multiple WHO recommendation on these nutrients. So WHO on sodium intake says that we should reduce sodium intake to reduce our blood pressure and risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, and coronary heart disease. And this is true for adults and children. Then we're also able to say that we should reduce the consumption of sodium to less than 2 grams per day, which is equivalent to 5 grams per day of salt. There's a lot of places where you consume sodium under other form, not necessarily as salt, for example, as sodium glutamate. So, these two numbers are equivalent, but both important. And you see, we have this way of framing recommendation. They are strong or conditional, and they are based on different qualities of evidence. We use the grade system to analyze the quality of the evidence. But this is a strong recommendation, means it's always valid in all contexts. And then we say that also this is a strong recommendation for children. The amount in children should be adjusted according to their body size. Why we're saying this? We're saying this because we have conducted a series of systematic reviews, and we've identified that really, if you compare in randomized controlled trials the groups that have that consume more sodium versus the group that consume lower sodium, there is a decrease both in the systolic and the diastolic blood pressure. Now, those numbers seem minute, 3-4 millimeters of mercury, but when it's projected on a population base, it makes a huge difference in terms of deaths and disability. This also tells us that this is valid both for people who have hypertension, you know, you have a lower, you have a bigger difference there. This is very small, but you know, I'm sure you can see that, you know, under the line hypertension, you see a bigger numbers there. But it's also true for people with no hypertension. So this is something that everybody would benefit from. And then, you know, looking at the other groups below, if you see the comparison, you know, those who consume less than 2 grams of sodium versus those who consume more than 2 grams of sodium, there's a difference. But if you go lower than that, if you go to 1.2 grams, which is about 3 grams of salt, you get even a greater benefit. So this is sodium. Fats. Fats, we're actually going to release soon new guidelines on total fat. We're saying that we should control the amount of total fat in our diets and keep it to less than 30% of total energy intake. And then we have to be concerned about the quality of fat. So saturated fat matter, despite what you hear in the media. Saturated fat matter. We should shift consumption of saturated fat away to unsaturated fat and eliminate industrial trans fat. I'm not sure you can see that in detail, but it doesn't matter. I mean, just look at the little diamonds on the bottom, and you see, and it says, these are the favors reduced fat. This is basically a number of trials. You see that so many trials of people with different levels of fat intake in their diet. And this is looking at body weight or other measures of adiposity, including waist circumference or percentage of fat. If you are for a sufficient long period on a lower amount of fat, the weight loss would be greater. If you instead change that, you'll gain weight. So for the prevention of unhealthy weight gain, it's actually healthier to keep our fat content of the diet to less than 30%. Some people can go beyond 30%. That's also possible. It depends on also what you put instead of that 30%. So these guidelines should be seen in the context of the overall guideline. You should not have less than 30% fat and have free sugars instead. So low-fat foods which contain high simple sugars are not a good option. And then we have released draft recommendation on saturated fatty acid. There have been a public consultation, so they're going to also to be completed and released shortly. The recommendation says that in adults and children whose saturated fatty acid intake is greater than 10% of total energy intake, we should reduce it. And that's a strong recommendation. Then, should we really go much below 10%? We have some evidence for that, but that's for us, it's a conditional recommendation. So we're using 10% really as a good number to say this is what the amount of saturated fat which we should consume. You get saturated fat from many sources. You get it in many animal products like cheeses, but you get it in meats. You get it from some vegetable oils that contain high amounts of saturated fat, such as palm oil or coconut oil. They're all equivalent to that regard. The trans fat story is similar. So we're saying we should not go more than 1% of total energy intake from fat, strong recommendation, and reducing to less than 1% is also a good thing to do, but we have sort of less compelling evidence on that. And then also, we can say that there's nothing wrong in going less than 1% of trans fat and 10% saturated fat, because there's no adverse event whatsoever on any function of adults and children. Now, the story of trans fat is that some of it comes from animal products, from the, it's produced in the rumen, so you have it basically in cheeses and milks. But, in most countries, the kind of intake of cheeses and milks would be basically allow you to stay to less than 1%. So the real problem is the polyhydrogenated vegetable oil, so it's the industrial trans fat. On free sugars, the recommendations are that we should reduce free sugars throughout the life course, and that's a strong recommendation. We're using 10% as the value for adults and children, but we also say that there is some evidence that if you bring the intake to less than 5% of total energy, then you have additional health benefits. And this is really the outcome of the randomized controlled trials. I know that EFSA has just released the opinion last year, and it's given us somehow the burden to say what's the number there. And so we're doing that. And the 10%, the rationale of 10% is, number one, unhealthy weight gain. And in those forest plots, you see that the top one is for adults, the bottom one is for children. Whenever there is a consumption of free sugars which is below which is above the 10%, then again there's more weight gain. When the intake is decreased, then weight gain is under control. For the 5%, we're using data on dental caries. So populations that have had intakes of free sugars less than 5% are completely free of dental caries. So no DMFT very close to 0. Now, on red meat and processed meat, we don't really have, as yet, a strong recommendation. We used to have, we have produced a report back in 2003 indicating that those who are not vegetarian are advised to moderate consumption of preserved meat, so really, pointing the finger to preserved meat, and this is the rationale for that was colonic cancer, and the report that you're probably very familiar with of the International Agency for Research on Cancer that was published in 2018 defines the consumption of red meat as probably carcinogenic to humans, and the consumption of processed meat is carcinogenic to humans, so in group A. So of course that points to a reduction from the health point of view of the consumption of both red meat and processed meat. New thing is the concept of ultra-processed food. We haven't embraced it yet. We do have a concern about high consumption of processed food because they contain high fat, sugar, and salt. This is the NOVA classification that was promoted in Brazil. And the last class is what we call the ultra-processed food, which is basically foods which are completely industrially produced where the consumption of the original ingredients is extremely low. Now, what we know about ultra-processed food, and this is a case study in Canada, is that when the consumption is high, then the risk, the odds ratio, the risk of having obesity is higher. But I'll leave it there. So it's something that we need to look at more carefully. But now let's move to the good side of it. The first message, and again, this is a recent systematic reviews. We're going to release the guidelines on carbohydrates also very soon with a public consultation to which we invite all of you to participate. And this is really related to, in this case, we have an analysis of several prospective studies where you see the risk of coronary heart disease or diabetes going down when the fiber intake goes up. And the range of healthy intakes is between 25 and 30 grams per day. If you go down until 40, there's still a bit of better benefit. Above 40 grams, you start to have a problem, for example, for the competition of absorption of certain micronutrients. So that is really a good, safe range. Now, where do you get this fiber? You get it from whole meal cereals. And again, you see if you get the whole meal cereals in the analysis, you see the more whole meal cereals, the better the health performance. But you also get it from legumes, and you also get it from fruit and vegetables. So we're coming to fruit and vegetables now. So from this analysis of the fiber, we can project that a good amount of fiber will come if you eat 400 grams of fruit and vegetables. But fruit and vegetables do not only have fiber. They have a lot of other important nutrients, vitamins, minerals, a lot of nutrients which we study with other methods, and we know that there's important value there. So if you look at fruit and vegetables versus the health outcomes, you can also see that having at least 5 portions of fruit and vegetable per day reduces overall mortality, 26%. If you look at cancer risk, you can also go beyond 400 grams until 800 grams. So definitely, 5 portions per day is the minimum. And then you should say 2 portions of fruit and 3 portions of vegetables. If you go further, probably quite large benefit for cancer. Polyunsaturated fat, and that's really my last one, I think it's just basically reinforcing what we said before about the total fats. Quality of fat is important. Replace the saturated fat with unsaturated. Polyunsaturated are good, but look, don't take supplements. There's a marginal benefit of consuming polyunsaturated fat. It probably reduces our risk of heart disease event and combined heart and stroke event. So good, important, but probably a little bit overrated. So going back to the original definition, we're probably able to be a bit more specific here and say that a healthy diet has to have a large basis of fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts, whole grains, at least 400 grams of fruit and vegetable per day, excluding potatoes, sweet potatoes, cassava, and other starchy roots, having less than 10% of total energy intake from free sugars, less than 30% of total energy intake from fats, use unsaturated fats better than saturated fat and trans fat of all kinds, less than 5 grams of salt per day, and drink a lot of safe tap water. Then, of course, it's not the whole story. We need to be concerned about the adequacy, we need to be concerned about the safety of foods, and we need to be concerned about overall amount and keeping the energy balance. But I think there's a fairly good consensus that this is the way to go, and I think it's great to all work together to make this happen and to have a transition of our food system that make our diets healthier and more sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco. I don't see any pressing questions here. I would like to check, can we already connect with Jan, or is it still not possible? Great. Jan, finally.
Yes, I hope it works. I heard I froze, so I could hear you, but I had to reconnect. So I'm sorry for the missing introduction. I also haven't seen a question yet in the chat. I would have one question on the ultra-processed food. I often get questions from the colleagues working on the environmental pressure that we would need more alternatives, plant-based alternatives, and often these are highly processed, a lot of ingredients, and often high in salt, for example, or sugars. What recommendations can we do? How much can we allow in order to be still within healthy diets?
No, thank you, and I think that's a very important point. We don't have as yet a recommendation on that, but yeah, we are noticing that kind of alternative offers that use wonderful legumes, and so you see on that side we can have a good consideration of these alternative products. Are very high in salt to create probably that palatability, and that's not to be rated among the healthy elements. So most likely it's a bit in between. I think we need to highlight these challenges because probably the producers of those products can improve them. I think that there's space for reformulation. Processing is not necessarily a negative thing per se. It depends on the outcome.
Thank you, Francesco. And I think your answer actually goes very much in line with a question from Constanza here in the chat. You talk about reducing salt, sugars, and fat, but how do consumers do that if the foods in the supermarket are loaded with these?
Well, I think there's a whole presentation on that. WHO talks about transformation of the food system across the whole supply chain. So, you have to start from really the kind of products. I mean, if we didn't have so much investment in maize, with subsidies of maize, we wouldn't have so much high fructose corn syrup, and then we wouldn't have so cheap drinks containing. So it has to be across the value chain, but there are specific things which we can do, and WHO says we should do. For the environment, making certain options that are unhealthy less appealing from the price point of view. So using taxation. Those who are more appealing, subsidies. So those price tools. Second, enable the consumers to make the right choices by giving them a clear message at the point of choice. Understand very clearly what is in a processed food through a very clearly understandable label by all. So front of the pack labeling. Number 3, marketing. I mean, we are, particularly our children, are pushed towards the consumption of certain products because of marketing. Marketing should be regulated. That's number 3. 4, making sure that what we offer in public institutions, and public institutions have an enormous purchasing power. Schools, hospitals, canteens, what you see at canteen here at the conference. By the way, it's actually a very good food offer, so well done. So that is to be healthier products. And that will also not only be a good offer for those who consume those foods, but it will be will have a trailer effect for the whole food system. And then let's talk to the producers and make sure that actually they change their products.
Thank you, fantastic. Alexander also has a question, but maybe Jan, we leave the questions for the panel discussion, otherwise it gets too late. So I think it's time to welcome our next speaker and to thank Francesco very, very much. I'm just checking that we're good to go with our next speaker. It's Johan Rockström. I think he doesn't need an introduction for anyone that has been following environmental sciences and global sustainability. He is behind the concept and the framework on planetary boundaries and this safe operating space for humankind. Hundreds of research articles, books, editorials in mainstream media, a wonderful speaker. He's also, of course, the director of the PIC, the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a professor at Potsdam University as well, and he has advisor roles in many, many important bodies like the World European Fund, the European Investment Bank, UN Sustainable Development Solutions Networks, etc. Johan, I'm not going to spend more time introducing you because I think it's more important to leave the floor to your talk. Thank you very much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's a privilege to be with you, and it's great to follow on Francesco Branca's brilliant overview on where we stand on the science policy recommendations on healthy diets. What I will want to do now is the next 20 minutes position the healthy food transformation within the context of planetary sustainability. What is at stake with regards to the food system transition, not only for people's health, but also for planetary health? And of course, the entry point is very dire. I mean, apart from all the statistics that is so well known in this room, I carry with me all the time this daunting figure that somewhere between 10 and 11 million people die prematurely every year because of unhealthy food, because of non-communicable diseases, malnutrition, obesity, so on and so forth. And now with the geopolitical instability, which I'll come back to, we have more and more people marching towards starvation, going from 80 million just 10 years back to up to 200 million people today. So the challenge of the food transition is really staggering, and it's really positioned and has to be positioned within the context of the scientific message to humanity that we've entered a whole new geological epoch, that we're now in the Anthropocene. We're putting pressure on the entire Earth system, and that what we are seeing is that climate change is not only one manifestation of this, but also the four crises that are interacting today. So at the tail end of the pandemic, a zoonosis, which is a virus spillover from wild animals, probably via domestic animals to humans, is not only manifestation of the Anthropocene in terms of unsustainable human pressures on natural habitats, it's also manifestation of unsustainable and risky food production behavior. The climate crisis has as the number one driving force, few people recognize this, that the food system is a larger cause behind global warming than the energy system on its own. We're in the sixth mass extinction of species. We're undermining the ecological functions of the Earth system, which drives and regulates not only food systems, but also freshwater quality, air quality, carbon sinks, and the whole livability of ecosystems. And all of this is interacting to a new level of turbulence, which requires placing the food system much more at the heart of strategy, at the heart not only of sustainability and health, but also on security, peace, and stability. And that will be my focus here. The IPCC actually confirms this. I mean, you have all followed the AR6 IPCC high-level conclusion that the science is now unequivocal. We're actually at risk of destabilizing the entire climate system, and the window for a safe landing is rapidly closing. We've entered the decisive decade. We need to cut emissions by half by 2030 for have a net zero world economy by 2050. But the IPCC is also very clear that this won't be successful. The safe landing cannot be done only with phasing out fossil fuels. We also need to come back within the safe operating space on the biosphere planetary boundaries, meaning that the living biosphere, nitrogen, phosphorus, land, biodiversity, freshwater systems, they are fundamental to regulate the state of the climate. And all of those are primary factors in the food system. So the food system is central to this whole transition. And what is at stake is so, overwhelming when you see the latest science confirming that our journey over the past 12,000 years, shown here on the x-axis, you have the last 22,000 years. This is the latest bias-corrected summary of all the ice core data that have been developed over the past 20 years on global mean surface temperatures over the past 22,000 years. We leave the last ice age 20,000 years ago. We come into the Holocene, the geological epoch that we're now leaving. 12,000 years ago, on the y-axis, you have global mean surface temperature. The 0 point is 14 degrees Celsius, a pre-industrial temperature. And what you see here from the Ostman et al. Paper from 2021 is this final confirmation. The Holocene is an extraordinarily stable state of the Earth system. It's actually a plus minus 0.5 degrees Celsius world, meaning that at 1.2 degrees Celsius of global warming so far, we are more than 2 magnitudes outside of the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age. Why is this so dramatic? Well, it's so dramatic because even though we've been around as modern humans on Earth for probably over 250,000 years, it's only in the last 12,000 years that we have developed agriculture, sedentary agriculture, and thereby civilizations as we know them. So the food system can, as far as we know, only exist, only thrive, and only deliver well-being to 7.8, soon to become 9-10 billion co-citizens on Earth within an Earth system that remains within this stable Holocene state. And we're pushing ourselves out of this. We have more and more evidence that this is well-founded scientifically. You can pull the timeline out even 3 million years, which you show here. Y-axis, again, global mean surface temperature. The 0 point, you see it there, 14 degrees Celsius, pre-industrial level. The green line is the first time a mathematical physical model with only the knowledge we have about external and internal feedbacks and forcings of the Earth system, the journey of planet Earth in terms of oscillations in and outside of glacial cold periods and interglacial warm periods. What you see is that, yes, the planet has had significant oscillations up and down. We've been on planet Earth during this period only in the last 250,000 years. But what is the key message here is that not at one time, as far as we understand today, even in the warmest situation on planet Earth, have we ever exceeded 2 degrees. The planet has stayed below 2 degrees Celsius in its warmest point and down to minus 5, 6 degrees Celsius in its coldest point. This is what I call today the corridor of life. And we know that the corridor of life has not been maintained only because of external forcings. It's also thanks to these systems, all the tipping element systems in the Earth system, meaning that the Earth system has an inbuilt resilience, an ability to absorb and dampen and keep the planet within this narrow corridor of life when the planet is in a healthy state. We have the numbers on this actually. 56% of our greenhouse gases caused by fossil fuel burning has been absorbed by intact nature. This is one proof point that a healthy planet buffers external stress. In this case, it's been us causing the stress. Here you have the 15 tipping element systems that scientifically are proven not only to regulate the climate system, but also to have multiple stable states. Push them too far, they cross tipping points, and they can go from cooling and dampening to self-amplifying and warming. This is not published yet. It's in review in Science, the final stages. It comes from the Earth Commission. What you see here is in the red embers diagram, the range of scientific confidence levels, and the higher the darkness of the hue, the higher the scientific certainty. The dotted lines is the median in the scientific literature. And what you see here is that there's a number of tipping element systems that are at risk already below 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, if you look at the first 5 to the left, they're actually at a median level at risk already at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. And we're talking about the Greenland ice sheet, we're talking about the West Antarctic ice shelf, we're talking about big systems like the boreal permafrost systems, meaning that we have so much evidence today that we have to stay away from 2 degrees and really, really land at 1.5. But to do that requires a massive transformation of the food system. And we showed in the Eat Lancet Commission work 2-3 years back that the food system is the single largest cause, shown here, for transgressing planetary boundaries. So 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, the single largest cause of loss of biodiversity, land use expansion, consumption of fresh water, 70% of the withdrawals of water from rivers and groundwater are used to produce food, and it's massively the dominant cause for eutrophication of freshwater system because of reactive nitrogen and phosphorus. So to put it simple, you want to come back into a safe operating space on planet Earth for humanity, you better fix the food system very, very rapidly. Or put it another way, which is shown in this study, if we fail on food, food can on its own push us beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius, shown in the business as usual carbon budget number furthest to the left. 1,500 gigatons of carbon dioxide would be emitted over the next part of this century if we continue producing food as today, and we would already have reached 2 degrees Celsius warming. So to put it simple, it won't be enough to become fossil fuel free. We would still miss Paris unless we have the food system transition. Same goes for biodiversity. We have so many studies, and here shown in red columns, the primary driving force behind loss of terrestrial, marine, and freshwater-based ecosystems is the food system, unsustainable production of marine protein or land-based protein. So we have a lot at stake, but it's quite interesting to recognize that the food system is not only the culprit, it's also victim number one. So it's shooting, but it's shooting itself in the foot. Here we have a recent study showing, for example, from Jonas Jägermeier and colleagues at the Potsdam Institute, that for maize, just look at the map to the left, the red countries are regions that will to at least 20 to 30% yield reductions already by 2040 under business as usual due to heat and water scarcity and disease patterns. While on the other hand, at least up until 2050, you'll probably have an increase in yields in the temperate north. This is one of these inequality wedges that are hitting into the food system. And we have more and more studies like this showing in orange the region that will be losing yield levels, very concentrated around the south 30, north 30 degree latitude range, but potentially stable for wheat in the northern and southern latitudes. So this is an enormous risk of geopolitical instability in the world, that we have this inequality arising. And this goes further. It's not only on production because of water scarcity and heat, it's also in terms of disease patterns, where, for example, the brown planthopper rice pest is at very large risk of hitting over 50% of Indian rice production. You can just imagine the impact if you get that kind of side effect hitting in parallel with what we're seeing right now in India, which closed export borders on wheat because of the heat waves. So when we analytically show that we need to get the food system back within planetary boundaries, and that we can only feed 3 billion people today within planetary boundaries, requires and gives a lot of support, evidence for the need for a healthy, sustainable agricultural revolution. Other studies have been giving other types of arguments for this. You have probably seen the Growing Better analysis of the Food and Land Use Coalition, just doing the math, showing that the global market value of the global food system is in the order of 10 trillion US dollars per year. But in fact, just factoring in health costs and environmental footprints, and you end up with a cost bill of 12 trillion. So, not only are we threatening human health and planetary health, we're actually doing it in a business-wise, very unclever way, because the whole system is actually in the red. And the only reason why the food industry is still making money is that the planet is subsidizing. And this is, of course, not a sustainable path. So that was the entry point for the Eat Lancet Commission, and Francesco Branca was a very important contributor for that. We've now launched the Eat Lancet 2.0 just 2 weeks back at the Stockholm Plus 50, wanting to do another scientific update. And there's so much advancements in both the health and sustainability science. We've decided in the Eat Lancet 2.0 to continue having the planetary boundaries as a framework, as a scientific framework to define quantitatively sustainable science-based targets for the food system. We're doing a new mapping on health, and we will certainly focus much more on salt, on sugar, on chemicals in this round, and Francesco emphasized that very clearly. The first assessment on healthy diets landed in the flexitarian diets, very much in line with Francesco's talk. For example, that on fruits and vegetables, we're talking of servings in the order of 400 to 500 grams per person per day to reach up to the whole grain fiber requirements, and reducing red meat is what the planetary health diet is suggesting. But interestingly, what we then did was to focus on the following question: how far can a healthy diet, eating healthy food only to serve our longevity and health for humans, also contribute to the health of the planet? And this was done through the planetary boundary analysis across different planetary boundaries, and you see them here on the x-axis up on top. We focused on 6 planetary boundaries, so greenhouse gases, land use expansion, consumption of fresh water, overloading of nitrogen, phosphorus, and loss of biodiversity. And then you have a whole set of different scenarios to the left hand, and the only one you have to focus on is the second highest, the second line from above, which is business as usual. Producing food in unsustainable ways today, wasting 30%, and continuing to eat unhealthy processed food, business as usual diets, would take us by 2050 outside of the safe operating space for all these boundaries. You're in the red across the entire range. But look at the line furthest down, a transition towards investing in regenerative, sustainable intensification methods, which we only picked existing technologies, conservation tillage systems, crop rotation systems, halting expansion into intact nature, building organic carbon with better green manuring, really fundamental methodologies that exist and have proven themselves to be scalable. Cutting waste by half, and eating the planetary health diet, the flexitarian diet, and it would actually take us back, as you see in the furthest down below, to green-yellow, yellow meaning that you're in the uncertainty range, basically back within a planetary boundary safe operating space. This is encouraging. Studies after this have given even more support for this. This is a really interesting study showing that if we, moreover, would be able for the livestock we still have in a planetary health diet, feed them not with feed that we can eat as humans directly as plant-based kilocalories or proteins, but feed them low opportunity cost feed, meaning alternative waste-based organic biomass, then we could drastically reduce the footprint of the global food system, which is shown in the graph furthest down. The orange bar there on the EL reference is the Eat Lancet reference diet, which corresponds to roughly 0.2 hectares per capita per year. If we would feed the remaining livestock with much less human edible plant-based foods, you could go down to something like 0.1 hectare per capita per year in ecological footprint. I mean, this is very significant. Study on the European Union shows the same thing, transitions towards even larger share of vegan and novel and future foods could further support, let's say, a transition back into a safe operating space. And the journey is mind-boggling. I mean, this is what the IPCC has confirmed. This is what the Eat Lancet confirmed, that we need to bend the global curve of emissions. If you look at the x-axis 2020, meaning now, this is greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalents. We need to have a net zero world economy by 2050. But that's not enough. In gray is the fossil fuel energy transition, and the red and yellow lines are the non-CO2 gases, the ones that are very, very coupled to the food system, namely nitrous oxide and methane. But the wedge, the dark red wedge, is the agricultural system today, meaning a big net source. And it has to turn into a big net sink, the darker green wedge below the zero line from 2050 onwards. And what I want to just remind everyone is that this is factored into the IPCC models. The only reason why we get an orderly phase out of fossil fuel energy transitions to net zero by 2050 within a 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide budget, the only reason why that remains for us to have, so we can have an orderly phase out from gas, oil, and natural gas and coal, is that we've already factored in the assumption that the food system will transition from source to sink. So it's not as if we have a choice. And the IPCC confirms this, that the only way to reach 1.5 is massive investments in AFOLU, in agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So this is where we are. We have a lot of the technologies. Sustainable intensification systems are today assessed to be actually adopted already by roughly 29% of farmers across the world. But the challenge, of course, is in the context today of a turbulent world. This is not a causality map, but it just shows a worrying trend in the world of the most food insecure regions in darker red with armed conflicts. There is this worrying overlap of food insecurity and armed conflicts. And we have all the statistics of how this is rising in a world of geopolitical instability and war in Ukraine, how Ukraine and Russia are such large providers of sunflower oil and wheat and maize, and that this is one source of instability in the world food market, but also providers of fertilizers and the rise with up to 100% in cost of nitrogen fertilizers, but also the potassium fertilizer imports in West Africa from Russia, for example. These are issues that just shows how we have taken globalization of the food system probably one step too far. We have gone for optimization and basically monoculturalization instead of really recognizing the importance of diversity and resilience building to keep a certain level of redundancy, to have some buffering capacity. And it worries me, and it worries many, that the FAO food price index is today at 160. It's higher than the day when people walked out on the Tahrir Square in Cairo with the slogan during the Arab Spring, food, dignity, freedom, food, dignity, freedom. Food was the number one word at the time, at the uprising of the Arab Spring. And these are issues that we also now have to factor into the planetary health and human health dimension of the food challenge. So therefore, the system transition, it's not a coincidence that scientists are starting to step up like this call for a food system transition that integrates security, health, and stability. And with that, therefore, the EFSA discussion is so important. Thank you very much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Johan. It's a roller coaster of feelings of tension and fear and some hope as well. There's some questions here in the chat. I think I will take one and then really progress Jessica will only come with a pre-recorded talk, so there will be no questions for her. So maybe we can save some time there, but we still are very much late. So the question we have here is, could the urgent need to secure food and agricultural resilience be met by a transition to predominantly plant-based food, using agricultural land directly for growing human food instead of animal feed? And the question is from Constanza. Thank you very much, Constanza.
I would say, I hear an echo there. Good, thanks. I would say it's as far as we know, it's not a silver bullet. It will certainly be one part of the solution. What we must stop doing, and that's well established scientifically, is to stop having the intensive red meat industry feeding animals with plant-based feed that can be consumed by humans, which not only can be consumed by humans, but also is transported across the world and which contributes to destroy intact nature. So for example, soybean exports from Brazil used an intensive red meat industry in Europe is a perfect example of a system that, if we would transition away from that, would give us a win-win and also build more resilient systems. On the other hand, one has to be a little bit careful, meaning that ruminant livestock is an integral part of livelihoods of the most vulnerable communities in the world, and so it's a question of finding the best diverse strategy forward, and we believe from the Eat Lancet work that one has to be very careful in let's say in culturally and geographically adapting that to the different contexts you're in. But there are some systems that actually are fundamentally unsustainable, and one of them is that linear, feed-based global meat industry system.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the inspiring talk. I know you're going to stay with us online for the panel discussion after. So, Jan, are you with us now, and do you want to introduce Jessica's talk?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. So I know we have more questions. Also, Lucia Reisch, our speaker from the second part, has a question, but I know we have to move on. And so I'm happy to introduce our last speaker, although she will not be here, as Sandra was saying, with us either online or in the room, but she thankfully recorded her talk. So the speaker is Jessica Fanzo, and she's a professor of global food policy and ethics at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. And as for all our speakers today, you could go on introducing many things, but I think I would agree with, or you would agree with me if I call her one of the leading food system experts in the world, and she has worked together and co-authored papers with many of our panelists or speakers today. And her recorded talk, she will talk to us about coming to grips with trade-offs in achieving human and planetary health in resource-constrained settings. And I know in the room, please, if you can start the talk, the recording.
Hello, my name is Jess Fanzo, and I am a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And today I'm going to be talking about coming to grips with trade-offs and achieving human and planetary health in resource-constrained settings. Let me share my screen. So let's talk about trade-offs and how we get towards human and planetary health when we think about food systems. So first of all, why do we need a food systems transformation? Well, the first reason is because food systems are contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions and natural resource degradation. When we look at all of the activities across food systems, both food and non-food, the food system is contributing to about 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions in the world. Other parts of the food supply chain beyond just methane from cattle digestion, methane from rice, emissions coming from manure and pasture management are also contributing to global greenhouse gases, but not as much as the agriculture production aspect of food systems. We also know that agriculture uses about 70% of all freshwater resources. Agriculture and food systems are contributors to biodiversity loss and animal and plant extinctions. And 60% of marine fish stocks are maximally sustainably fished. So food systems play a big role, not only in contributing to global greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but could also serve as a carbon sink. At the same time, we know that climate change is having significant impacts on food systems, as well as all human systems. This graph from the latest IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out this year, shows that when we look across different regions of the world and even globally, there will be increasing adverse impacts on water scarcity, agriculture production, animal and livestock health and productivity, and fish yields and aquaculture production, which has significant impacts on infectious disease burdens, heat, malnutrition burdens, mental health, and displacement. Another reason why we need food systems to transform is because suboptimal diets are now one of the top risk factors of disease and death. This is data coming from the Global Burden of Disease Project showing that dietary risks are now contributing significantly to morbidity and mortality of things like cardiovascular disease, chronic respiratory infections, diabetes, stroke. So more and more, the diets that we are consuming that are available to the global population are having detrimental impacts on human health. Another reason to transform is because inequities across food systems are deepening and plaguing progress. 3 billion people cannot afford what is considered a healthy diet. This map is showing you in dark brown populations where 75 to 100% of the population in places like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, can't afford what is considered a healthy diet. So huge inequities as we look across who can access what kinds of foods, both physically and economically. Another reason to transform is because malnutrition is increasing. It's getting worse. Hunger is worsening around the world. Stunting and wasting, chronic and acute malnutrition of children is really not decreasing fast enough and stagnating in some places. And now we have places where in most pockets of the world where obesity, overweight, and non-communicable disease is rising. This map on the right shows you places with the darker colors where there are significant burdens of the double burden of malnutrition, undernutrition among women and children, and overweight and obesity in places in the world. And this malnutrition burden is universal. Every country struggles through some form of malnutrition. But when we think about the transformation, we also have to think about trade-offs to get to that transformation. Many places around the world are struggling to have positive transformation without experiencing some trade-offs. Well, why is that? Well, the first reason is that food systems are incredibly complex. They involve many components across food supply chains, food environments, individual factors that are all shaping and shifting these different outcomes that we want food systems to bring, be they environment, nutrition, health, economy, social equity, inclusion. And these components have different trade-offs depending on what is invested in, what is emphasized. Not everything flows in positive directional paths. Some different decisions that we make politically, different decisions that we make programmatically across food systems can have detrimental impacts on certain outcomes. And a lot of that has to do with drivers that push and pull food systems in different directions, be they technology, climate change, urbanization, trade policies, private investments, urbanization, population pressure and growth. All of these drivers, many being external to the food system, have feedback loops on food systems themselves and can influence the different outcomes that we want our food systems to bring. There's many trade-offs because food systems also work across and act across multiple levels and different types of actors. So we've got long value chains, short value chains. We have transnational companies to smallholder farmers. There's many scales of interaction of systems that create different outcomes of food systems, and different trade-offs come with those. So it's not that food systems are static, they're dynamic. They're interconnecting in different ways across different spatial scales that tick off and produce different trade-offs as they move along towards specific outcomes like food security. And trade-offs also happen because food systems do not sit in isolation. They interact with other systems like the health system, environmental system, the global economic system. So where there's a shock to one system may have implications on another system. Think of COVID being a health shock, has had secondary ramifications on every other system in the world that we are still feeling the effects of. So these systems don't sit in isolation. They can have negative and positive interactions with each other and create trade-offs in between. And when we look at trade-offs, this is some work that we did looking across different aspects of food systems, different indicators, and you can see where the blue are positive feedbacks and the red are negative feedbacks. And you can see that in some, across some indicators, like the retail value of ultra processed food has negative implications on food system sustainability, or the relative caloric price of junk food has negative implications on food system sustainability. So depending on what we're looking at, it can have implications across food systems, their sustainability and resilience. So this is one way of looking at trade-offs, looking across drivers, looking at outcomes of food systems and how do they relate to each other. So what can we do to achieve human and planetary health when we have all these intricate players, intricate components of food systems, system interactions, trade-offs of different elements of food systems? How do we achieve human and planetary health? I want to argue that we need to first understand who suffers the consequences of the world's dietary choices. The poor, the rural, the geographically isolated, women, girls, children, the marginalized, the discriminated, those that are dealing with areas of conflict. All of these populations inequitably suffer from the choices that we all make in our diets every day and the interactions that we have in our food system. And when we think about being global citizens and our social contract in the world, how do we ensure that these populations don't get left behind? Some countries and individuals will need to make bigger changes to their diets if we want to protect our global population and ensure that everyone can get access to a healthy diet. Energy-intensive lifestyles and dietary choices, particularly of those living in high-income countries, are significant anthropogenic contributors to climate change, and poor populations, marginalized populations, will disproportionately suffer from those choices. Here's just a graph showing you the animal food consumption in the United States. This is per capita, as compared to places like Kenya, Cambodia, Senegal, Ethiopia. When we think about the potential implications of animal source foods on the planet, we can see that some places need to make bigger shifts in reducing their animal source foods than others if we want to stay within the planetary boundaries of the world. Some people will have to rely on food assistance and strong social protection programs, not only in the near term as we see the economic issues being played out with the Ukraine-Russia conflict, inflation, recession, coming out of the COVID pandemic. But this will probably be a need in the long term and help families, communities get through these harder economic times. We're going to need to rely on food assistance and social protection. Another thing to consider to meet both human and planetary health is the kind of food that we're growing. Now, when we have over 800 million people going to bed hungry every night, and that number will increase over the next several months into the next year or 2 years, is growing cattle, for example, the best use of finite resources like our land? We don't want to extensify and continue the loss of biodiversity. So what kind of foods should we grow that are low on the environmental footprint, but can feed 8-9 billion people? Well, livestock, although important from a nutritional perspective, they use about 77% of the agriculture land in the world, but only supply 18% of global calories. Is that the best use of that land? That's a question. We know that livestock is the biggest contributor to deforestation, a lot of biodiversity in forests. Forests act as a carbon sink. So it's important for us to think about what kind of foods do we want to grow in the world that use the land that we have, not extensify, but that can feed the world and feed the world well. Of course, deforestation is huge, cattle being the biggest driver of deforestation. We need to be thinking carefully about not extensifying into primary forests, which can contribute significantly to biodiversity loss. The third area, as we think about meeting human and planetary goals, is who shapes and governs food systems? How do we ensure that producers, smallholder farmers are protected? We've got 1.5 billion food producers. We have almost 8 billion eaters. But along the middle part of the value chain of food systems, there's an incredible consolidation and concentration. Now, with that comes incredible power. And we have to ask ourselves, who holds the power in shaping and shifting food systems in different directions? Transnational food corporations, private sector hold a lot of power. And that constitutes a major challenge for governments to shepherd food systems in the right direction. So we need stronger governance of food systems, stronger governance of governments governing their food systems. We need to ensure that they provide food, it's available, affordable, accessible, that food is diverse. We need to introduce regulations to incentivize sustainable food choices by lowering prices and disincentivizing unhealthy and unsustainable food production and availability through taxation. And we need to implement policies that help consumers with their choices. It's difficult for consumers, eaters, to make the right choices when food environments are so unhealthy. So how do we ensure that these food environments are healthy, that they're providing low cost, sustainable, healthy foods that make it easier for eaters to make choices that benefit themselves and benefit the planet? And we need to also consider who will feed the world. We need to support farmers. Farmers, there's very few of them. More people are becoming urbanites. This quote from Ruth DeFries at Columbia University: "Now we are transforming from farmers to urbanites. Our newest experiment to feed massive numbers of people from the work of just a few is just beginning. The outcome is yet to be seen." We need to support small-scale farmers and other small-scale food actors, support and provide innovation so they can produce nutritious food get those foods to market, promote and support their livelihoods. We need large-scale actors. We need to incentivize them to produce nutritious, sustainable, cheap and convenient foods, not just cheap and convenient, but healthy and sustainable, cheap and convenient foods. And we need to invigorate youth to work and invest in food systems. We need to bring younger people to the table. They've got a lot of rich, wonderful ideas, and we need to ensure that they're supported and ensure that food systems is a viable place for them to work. And I want to thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Jess is probably sleeping now, but it's a good thing we gave her this round of applause to thank her for the wonderful talk. Jan, we move towards the panel discussion. You agree?
I agree, absolutely. And while you move, I think in the chat there's a lively discussion about animal source food. And there has also been a question on the affordability of a healthy diet. And also Jessica Fanzo highlighted this topic. So maybe you get some inspiration for this panel discussion or also the next one. So I'll hand over to you, the room.
And I will hand over to Silvia Valtueña Martinez. She will moderate this panel discussion. Stephanie van der Weijeren could not, unfortunately, be with us. Silvia is actually the hands and pretty much a big part of the brain behind this session. So thank you, Silvia, also for bringing us all together here. She's an MD, she's a PhD in human nutrition, and she's also a senior scientific officer at EFSA, where she works on the NDA panel. So that's nutrition, novel foods, and allergens, things like health claims, dietary reference values, etc. Silvia.
Thank you, Sandra.
Your panel.
Can you hear me? Yeah, because I just lost the microphone, so among the other things that could go wrong. So thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you to all the speakers that contributed this morning. I think we got a lot of sustainable food for thought, many reasons to get eco-depressed, but also many reasons to have hope. Hope in the fact that we may change things, and that, as Johan said, many bullets may be needed to do that in a concerted way. So we need to collaborate across countries and governments and actors. But I will invite Francesco to join us, and also Johan Rockström. I think he's online already. And I will ask our panelists the first question that will be, among all the things we saw this morning could be done, what would be the single one that you consider most important and requiring the quickest change in the food system? Francesco.
Well, as we heard, no silver bullet, but we have the menu of actions. I think the first one would be to improve the offer of food. So the food environment is something that is that governments can do and consumers can do. So I think that the dietary shift is the first one we need to do.
Johan?
Yeah, I think a complicated one, but what I would take the bull by the horn is to start putting a correct price on food. So basically, started looking at the economic policy measures to start essentially what we're doing on climate with a price on carbon. You'd like to have a price on biodiversity, on organic carbon, on nutrient overloading, on chemical overloading. So we correct the market failure in the food system. Now, this will have a spillover effect, which will have major challenges because food will become more expensive, but it will be giving the right incentive. So we need to combine it with a kind of massive social compensation scheme for the most vulnerable and low-income households. So to address Jess Fanzo's points about trade-offs that we have to make this correction to accelerate the path in the right direction with price mechanisms, but at the same time compensate so that we get a softer line to make it easier for consumers to choose health and sustainable options.
Actually, that was another question I had. I was wondering when looking at your presentations whether food actually may be too cheap, and whether, at least in Western societies, consumers would be ready to pay more for food that is sustainably produced and that is nutritious food. Because that may be part of the problem in the obesity scenario we have in Western countries, that food may be too cheap.
Well, I think, the economists will tell you that, the price of food depends on many factors, but you need to decompose that price of food. The food is definitely too cheap for the producers, so the farmers don't get the right food, don't get the right price for what they produce. In fact, in many cases they have to avoid collecting the crops, fruit and vegetables, for example. So there are distortions in the way that food is determined. And then there's of course increases in price determined by the manufacturing and by the distribution. I think the distribution is the part which is taking most of the price. And then this differences between the what is paid to the farmers to the cost of food is different according to different categories of food. And the issue of the highly processed food is that they become extremely cheap. And basically very little goes to the primary producers. So probably in general the mechanism to which we pay food needs to be changed, but that's why public policies are important. So the taxation on the one hand and the subsidies on the other hand can actually make what Johan was saying, that readjust to the true cost of food.
Actually, yesterday in the plenary session, we heard from many speakers that legislation could be really a good bullet to play. And the quicker we do that, the better. But I would like to take now one question from the audience, Francesca Zani, that is asking Johan Rockström, how do we make transnational corporations to comply with the food system transition? So how can we reduce the power they have?
Yeah, I think the most important is to go along the lines that you just mentioned, which is legislation. That we need regulatory measures, not only market-based incentives through price signals, but also putting much harder legislations in place on for example, health standards, just as Francesco went through on all the evidence we have of the enormous benefits of avoiding high processed food items and overloading with salt and sugar. I mean, all of these factors can be regulated in a much more active way. And I can say that in the EAT fora over the years, I've been quite surprised as a scientist to sit with CEOs across really high competitive food industries saying that, look here, if we could just pre-competitively agree, we would be really willing to compete with a lower sugar level in our consumer portfolio. It's just that we cannot do it, because as soon as we individually reduce sugar, we will be outcompeted by our competitors. So I think there is much more that can be done here with what we can call hard sustainability or hard regulatory measures, and of course they should be done in dialogue. But I think we can do much more. We should try to do much more than we are able to do today.
I'm going to give the word to Jan, that he has a question from Lucia. Jan?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I can pose Lucia's question. She could almost go directly, but so I read it out. So how to deal with the immense complexity of the facts and geographical relativity, So, for example, in the US, biodiversity impact of the recommended Mediterranean-style diet with farmed fish is huge, much larger than the biodiversity impact of a low-meat US type of diet. So it seems almost impossible to communicate to consumers. The question originally was to Johan Rockström in the talk, so I'm not sure whether he wants to try to address it.
Okay, no, this is a really important question. At the same, well, I think a two-part answer to this. I mean, number one is it's absolutely correct that it's very complex. It's very site specific. You have some places in the world where local fish farming based fish protein can be a sustainable option in a diet, but other places you may produce the fish in ways that causes higher impacts on biodiversity loss than for low meat consumption based more conventional diets. That complexity is there, and it's really good to see that we have so much of life cycle analysis going on at different scales. At the same time, I would say let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. There is this tendency in academia of always going towards intellectual perfection. And I mean, the big strand is well established, that if we can start moving towards more plant-based diets, that will take us an enormous step forward, irrespective of whether we have certain levels of trade-offs or certain levels of pros and cons along the way. And same goes with marine-based or freshwater-based fish protein. We know that the only way to feed 10 billion people in the world is a transition towards more plant-based diets and a transition towards more marine and freshwater-based protein. We will not be able to sustainably feed humanity with the current red meat or white meat-based industry we have on pigs, poultry, and livestock. So we have to make it work with fish farms and different forms of marine protein, the blue protein. The question is just how, and we have successes in some places and problems in other places. So, I mean, I don't think one should rule out solutions just because we are on a learning curve.
Thank you, Johan. I will have a last question for Francesco. Globally, WHO takes care of the whole world. So globally, we have heard about different forms of malnutrition, from energy protein malnutrition to obesity. Thinking globally, you think it's only a matter of food redistribution, of granted equal access to food, or is something else at stake?
Well, certainly there is an issue of accessibility and affordability of healthy diets. And, in order to do that, you've heard, we need some radical societal transformation. And first and foremost, I think the economic dynamic. I mean, food is a commodity. And so the kind of, public investment, for example, that are made, which are encouraging private investment, are actually pushing the whole food system in a completely wrong direction. So I think it's impossible to have a discussion over the affordability of food if we don't consider this. And if you think, for example, of the distortive effect that the Farm Bill in the US has, I'm sorry to say, but why do we have sugar sweeteners at such a low cost, and why the ultra-processed food are so cheap? Because it continues to be heavily subsidized. Actually, public subsidy, agricultural subsidies are number one voice of investments of government, but they are going in the wrong direction. And then, if you think of the cheap cost of palm oil, which is the cheapest fat we have in the world at the moment, there's been a lot of investment in research and development, in trade facilitations that now make it a competitive crop. So if there is an alignment of the public investment towards those health and sustainability goals, I think we can actually shift. So that's one component. So aligning to the objectives of healthy and sustainable diet. Then the other aspect is, affordability means also the resources that people have. And we have, enormous inequality. So I don't think it's possible in certain circumstances to avoid an adequate social protection system. People need to have, a decent and well-paid job. And we need to reorient, the social support network also to support healthy and sustainable diet. I mean, in the United States, you have so many people who are relying on the subsidies. And only recently, only a couple of years ago, the United States government reorganized the food basket offered towards healthy diet. So I think those are, elements that we need to consider. But yeah, having a healthy and sustainable diet is the good recipe to address all those nutrition challenges in the world. The stunting, the wasting, the macronutrient deficiency, and the obesity. They are part of the same problem. Of course, we have also to address quality of health systems, and we have to provide the services and the management response to the people who are affected. But before that, prevention starts from the big transformation of the food system.
Thank you, Francesco. So I hear legislation could be one way out, redistribution of incentives maybe to young generations of farmers, as we hear from just Fanzo trying to produce food in a different way. And with this, I pass the word to Sandra. And I will just close the session, right? Because I think it's time for our break, at least for those that are here. There's coffee. Yes. Outside. And for those that are at home, be back with us in 30 minutes. I thank very, very much all the speakers, the moderator, my co-chair, all the audience, everyone that interacted through the app, and a big round of applause to you all. See you in 30 minutes. Welcome back to our audience. Colleagues are still taking a seat. Jan, I see you are struggling with the computer, or you're ready?
No, I'm ready. Just that between taking notes and being on the screen with the chat sometimes comes with challenges. So shall we start slowly to go on, right?
Well, we will actually start, Jan, sorry. Marco had to leave for 5 minutes, so we thought maybe we start with Klaus, if that's fine with you?
Fine with me, absolutely.
Okay, great. So welcome to our audience here, and again to our audience online, to the second part of our session, human nutrition in a finite world and how to secure healthy and sustainable diets for all. And in the second part of the session, we will concentrate a little bit more on Europe, and I think we will also concentrate a little bit more on solutions, or so I hope, because we need some hope, or more hope. I think we already had several glimpses of hope from the talks that we had earlier, but we could also see how dramatic the situation is. Then maybe we start with Klaus. Thank you so much, Klaus, for agreeing to start the session. Klaus Grunert, he's our consumer behavior guru. I would say it like this. A lot of work and research in the areas of food choice, on labeling, for example. Klaus is a professor of marketing at Aarhus University. He's also the founder of MAP. That's the Center for Research Value Creation in the food sector. He has led or participated in many EU studies, and is also the author of hundreds of publications and tens of books. Marco, we started with Klaus, not to delay the session further. Okay? Klaus, then the floor is yours.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have 15 minutes, and I hope the slides are coming up. I have 15 minutes, thank you, to give you an overview of the determinants of food choice of consumers and of the possibilities it gives for furthering consumer change. This is the wrong presentation. This is the right presentation, thank you. So drivers of food choices and drivers for change. And before coming to the actual drivers, let me say one thing which maybe has already become obvious here during yesterday and today of the conference, namely that the role of consumers is crucial in the green transition. And that is because consumers have two roles here. One is that consumers, by their behavior, obviously have a strong impact on the environmental impact of the food sector, not only by their buy, but also by the way they prepare foods, the diet they choose, where they store food, what they do with the waste, of course, always is all is very important from a sustainability perspective. But in addition to that, consumers are the gatekeeper with regard to everything that happens further up in the value chain. Because if we want the green transition to happen, we need a lot of new products on the market. We need products that are healthier, we need products that are more sustainable, and if consumers demand these products and adopt these products quickly, it will speed up the green transition, and the opposite, of course, is also true. If consumers are skeptical about these products, if consumers don't want them, it will delay the green transition. And for that reason, consumer behavior, consumers' food choices are a major factor in the green transition of the food sector. Now, what I will do here, I will use this framework here to talk about determinants of food choice and derive from that potential drivers of change. And this is a framework here that has been used widely with regard to analyzing behavioral change from an environmental perspective. It says that human behavior, in our case here, are sustainable and healthy food choices, has three major groups of determinants: motivation, ability, and opportunity. Opportunity, in our case here, means whether the food environment enables healthy and sustainable choices, for example, by the products that are available on the market. Ability means whether consumers are able to actually find those products, identify them, are able to actually make healthy and sustainable choices given that these products are on the market. And then finally, of course, are consumers motivated to make healthy and sustainable choices? And maybe that may seem self-evident, but it's not, because consumer choices are driven by multiple motives, and sustainability may not necessarily in all situations be the most important of them. So I will use this here as a framework to discuss determinants of food choice and derive from that possible levers for behavioral change. But before going through that, I have one other preparatory thing to say about consumer behavior, which I think is really important in order to understand ways in which we can change consumer behavior. And that has to do with the way in which consumers make decisions. And on the left here, you have the system 1, system 2 distinction, which many of you probably have heard about before. It has been popularized by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, who says that there are basically two kinds of processes we have in our mind which have an impact on our decision making. The one is reasoning. We think things through. We think about the pros and the cons and the trade-offs before making a decision. And the other one is intuition. Now, where we don't think a lot, we make spontaneous decisions. They are driven by emotions. They are almost automatic. And it's no secret that for many years, food policy has had an implicit assumption that consumer food choices are system 2 decisions. Now, they are based on reasoning, and that's why we can change consumer decisions by appealing to their reasoning and saying, look, these are the advantages of having a healthy diet. But we know now that the way in which we can change consumer behavior from that approach are limited, because many consumer food choices are more of a system 1 nature. And I have on the right here a piece of research which very simply looks at the time it takes for consumers to make a decision in the store. It's simply with a stopwatch, the time from when consumers arrive at the shelf until they leave again with at least one product in their basket. And this is for 6 products in 6 countries. If you take the overall average, it's around 25 seconds. And that even is misleading, because we have a lot of consumers using only 10 or 15 seconds to make decisions. Then we have a few consumers using several minutes, and therefore bringing the overall mean up. But the message here is consumer food choices are made very quickly. Most decisions are made in the store, they're made very quickly, they are many times habit-based, and that means the room for appealing to reasoning and conscious trade-offs and so on is limited. It may be increasing in some areas, I come back to that, but as a point of departure, we need to keep in mind that this is a major characteristic of consumer decision-making that we need to take into account if we want to bring about changes in consumer behavior. So with that as a background, then let me come to the first group of factors here, namely the opportunity. Does the food environment enable healthy and sustainable choices? And there are three major factors that play a role here. First of all, we need the right products. And we need products that actually are healthier and are more sustainably produced than the products that are currently on the market. Secondly, we need the right information, because consumers need to be able to distinguish the healthier and the more sustainable from the less healthier and the less sustainably produced products. And this information needs to be credible and easy to understand, because otherwise it will have no impact on consumer behavior. And finally, there is the issue about the price and the affordability. The healthier and the more sustainable product needs to be affordable, because obviously there are limits to how much a price premium consumers are willing to pay for the healthier and for the sustainable alternative. And this pricing actually is a difficult matter, because on the one hand, the possibility that a producer can achieve a price premium for a product that is more sustainable, of course, provides a commercial incentive for developing more sustainable products, which is a good thing. And if everything works well over time, then competition can bring about that the overall level of sustainability on the market rises. But on the other hand, that's not always happening, and it may take a long time, and it leaves the question open, what about those consumers that cannot afford those products here? And of course, we have taxes and subsidies as an instrument there, but I think it's also important to realize that food chain actors' pricing policies are a major factor here. We have seen in history, for example, that the growth in organic products, among other things, was related to some retailers lowering the margins for organic food because they thought that was good for their own competition, and there was a social responsibility aspect in that as well. And there's no reason why food chain actors should not combine commercial interests and social responsibility and their pricing policies for healthier and more sustainable foods. And I think it's an aspect that warrants more attention. So what that means in terms of the drivers of change here, first of all, as I already said, we need new products. And innovation in the food sector actually is a major driver of change also from the consumer perspective. And we know that there has been lots of investment in innovation into new products, but we also need to take into account that these new products need to be developed with consumer preferences and consumer decision-making kept in mind. Because if consumers don't adopt them, then obviously these new products will not bring about any behavior change. Labeling and consumer trust, I have more to say there about that here on the next slide. And then the right price, and I've already mentioned both taxes and subsidies and the pricing policies of food chain actors here in that context. Now, the labeling and information thing is something that fills a lot in the public debate. So I have a few more words to say about that one. One thing is, this is to a large extent a question of trust. Because if consumers don't trust the information that is on the product, it will have no impact on their behavior. Also, trust is very, very important. And we have some information on the trust that people have in different food chain actors in Europe based on the EAT Food Trust Tracker instrument. From there, this graph here is, which shows that all the differences in food chain actors. There's most trust in farmers, and that applies in all countries where this study has been taking place. There's less there's less trust in the other food chain actors, manufacturers, retailers, and also authorities. A lot of differences between countries, but this is the overall picture here. And we have also looked at what are the major drivers of trust. We have looked at people's beliefs in, are the food chain actors, are they competent? That means, do they know what they're doing? Do they care about the public? No, that means, do they take the public and consumers' interest and needs into account in what they're doing? And are they open about what they are doing? And the last one, the openness, is a major driver of consumer trust and is also the one where food chain actors currently score lowest. And that is both good and bad. It's actually good in the sense that this is maybe the most actionable component. Because everybody, every single food chain actor can increase transparency in what they are doing, can be open to the public, and if actors do that, it will increase consumer trust and it will make it easier to provide information about which products are more sustainable and which are healthier, and it can have an impact on consumer behavior. Having said all that, labeling is a complex issue. On the one hand, labeling is a necessity. We need to inform consumers about which products are healthier and which products are more sustainable. Having said that, we should not overestimate the effects of labeling, because we now have a lot of experience with nutrition labeling, and we know that the effects are limited. And it has partly to do with what I said before about the way in which consumers make decisions, namely mainly system one decisions which are fast and not really thought through. That means any label that should have an impact in these 15, 20 seconds that consumers use to make a decision in the store, it needs to be simple and easy to understand. And that's why I think the Nutri-Score as a nutrition label has been a major breakthrough, really, in providing labeling in the nutrition area in a form that is actually adapted to this way in which consumers make decisions. But what about then if we add the sustainability perspective? The figure on the right-hand side is from a recent study where somebody has looked at what happens when we add a similar sustainability label to the nutrition label. Same format as the Nutri-Score, already familiar to people, but of course the two can diverge. A product can be high in nutrition, but not so high in sustainability, and the other way around. What happens then? And that study found out, well, what happens? Not a lot happens. People look at the nutrition label, that has a certain impact on their choice. Adding the eco label really doesn't make a big difference. And I think the major explanation for that is if we now have two labels and they may be conflicting with each other, we ask people to think about it. We ask people to reason, think about trade-offs and so on. And sometimes people do that, but most of the times people don't when they are in the store and spend these 15, 20 seconds making decisions. So it's actually a problem for how we solve that, providing this kind of information, which is so simple that it can be used by consumers in this type of decision-making here. So providing opportunity, just to repeat the main points here, requires healthier and sustainable products on the market that are developed with consumer preferences in mind. It does require that we label them in a credible, trustworthy, and simple way. But we should not be unrealistic with regard to the kind of changes that we can expect by this alone. Now, to the ability then. The ability means whether consumers are able, given the supply of products on the market, to make the right choices. And it leads us to a term which has been widely used in the literature, which is food literacy. Food literacy is the cognitive ability to make decisions to support the achievement of personal health and a sustainable food system. It's one of the new definitions of the term. There are others. But this one I think is very nice. And food literacy actually is a difficult thing because it involves a lot of different decisions that consumers make. And the ones that have been mostly investigated when we talked about making healthier decisions are intra-category decisions, where people are asked to find the healthy alternative within the same product category. And that by itself turned out to be a complex task. And that is the simplest of consumer decisions. Because on top of that, we have decisions across different product categories, buying this or the other, decisions about having a whole diet, and a lot of other things that have not to do with the food choice, but with decisions about storing food, preparing meals, and handling the food waste. And if you take, for example, the desire to reduce meat consumption, what does that involve? It first of all involves consumers making decisions to adopt some substitutes instead of the meat, but in the long run, it involves having a completely different diet where the meal composition on the plate actually changes from something we have been used to for many decades, namely there's a meat component and two other components on the plate. All of this will have to change. And it's a range of complex decisions that consumers need to go through. And having said that, in the light of what I said earlier and the way consumers make food-related decisions, it's clear that this is a difficult process because it requires that people reflect the decisions that they routinely, automatically, and habitually make. One term that we can use here is that we may want to achieve a higher degree of mindfulness in food decisions. Now, that is also a difficult process, but we have some indications that with disruptive events like the COVID crisis, that actually that may have pushed a little bit in that direction. We did some research on changes to people's food-related behaviors because of the COVID pandemic, and 60% actually didn't have any changes. That is the biggest part, showing the resilience of food habits. But among those that changed, the biggest part is the green in the pie diagram on the right, actually are those that shifted towards a more mindful type of choosing food, doing less impulse buying, reading more what is on the label, doing more about trade-offs, doing the kind of thing which would be favorable to the kind of changes that we are making. Whether that will stay also now in the light of the new crisis, which brings up food prices, we don't know. It could push in the same direction, could also have an opposite effect, but I'm showing this in order to also have this sign that maybe we have some developments that result in a higher degree of mindfulness in food choices. And increasing food literacy, of course, is a question of education. It's a more long-term investment, but it's an important investment. By education, we can increase food literacy. We can build up the cognitive abilities of making these choices. The next step then is encouraging people also to use those abilities when they actually make decisions, both in the store and when planning their meals. But I think we have maybe seen small developments in that area, and it's in line with the literature on habit formation and decision making that disruptive events like the COVID-19 pandemic can contribute to that. Now, the motivation then, the third factor here, are healthy and sustainable choices important to consumers? Well, we would think, of course, they are, right? But when we look at this result, it was also shown yesterday from a Eurobarometer study from 2 years ago, what are the most important factors when choosing food? It's taste, safety, and cost. So it's not sustainability. Sustainability comes further down the line. So there are food choices governed by multiple motives, and sustainability, at least at present, is not the most important among them. Motivation is related to underlying values that don't change very quickly. They do change. I think we have a rise in the importance of what we call biospheric values, but it's a slow process. On the other hand, we can, in the choice situation, do something about the motives, which are related to values, but which are sort of more affectable by cues. And much of the nudging literature, one of the instruments there called priming, actually is about making certain motives that are latent, present in the mind of the consumer, like health and sustainability, more salient at the time of choice, and that actually can have an effect on consumer decision making. But the best way of coming across the motivation barrier is, of course, to make sure that there are no trade-offs. And also that has been said before. If the sustainable product also is the healthier product and the product that has the best taste and it is affordable, of course, then it's a no-brainer. People will choose it. And this is one of the major challenges we have here. And we find, for example, in organic consumption that many people think that the organic product is a tastier product, even when that objectively may not be the case. On the right-hand side shows that if you label something as organic, people think it's tastier, even after having tasted it. But on the other hand, the left-hand side, this is about meat substitutes. if you present people the possibilities of an algae or a pea burger as an alternative to a beef burger, people, as a spontaneous reaction, say it will not be as good in terms of the taste. And that's some of the barriers we need to come across. So food choices are governed by multiple motives. It's not likely to change. We can influence the relative weight of these motives at the time of the decision making, but the most important thing is that we reduce the trade-offs that people face when they make choices. The last thing then I want to address is the time perspective, and it's actually important. Because food products are bought very frequently. That's why many food choices are made out of habit, and it's therefore important that people choose a sustainable alternative not only once, but that they develop a habit of choosing the healthier and sustainable alternative. Over time, people learn based on the taste experience that they have with the food, and they learn based on the additional information that is coming to them about the choices that they've made. And what can happen over time? You could have an outcrowding effect, that the taste dominates over time the decision and not the information about the sustainability, because the taste you can perceive and the sustainability is a question of information and credibility. But maybe we can mitigate by providing more information, by providing feedback to consumers which say, this is good, you have done this and that here to bring about the green transition, and we can, by providing feedback, encourage consumers to keep on making sustainable choices. And we can try to use taste as an agent of change, because the tasty product is in most cases the one that people will prefer. If the sustainable and healthy alternative is the tastiest alternative, this will be the alternative that people choose. And we have research on meat substitutes, for example, showing that over time people lose the real meat as a benchmark, and their taste preferences become adapted to the meat alternative. So over time, people can learn the new tastes, and taste preferences can also adapt. And it's an important way of bringing about these kinds of changes here. Finally, maybe the biggest hurdle, this is also from this Eurobarometer study. If you ask people, is your diet, would you personally say that your diet is healthy and sustainable? And you can see here, most people say in either always or most of the time. That is a huge barrier. If people don't think what they're doing actually contributes, has negative effects both on their own health and on the health of the planet, it's something that then it becomes difficult to change their behavior. So summing up, overall conclusions, the major point I'm having here really is none of these factors that I've been through here is a magic bullet. The real conclusion here is all of these factors need to be in place. And I think this distinction about opportunity, ability, and motivation is useful. All three of them we need to do something about. If we do that, then we have the best chance of bringing about the green transition in the food sector. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for telling us how we choose and how much is at stake when we're standing in the supermarket. Klaus, there's 2 questions here for you. I think the question from Anne. Anne, if you don't mind, I have the feeling that Marco will address part of it, and if he doesn't, then we can come back to it in the panel. So I would just ask also in seeing the time, Klaus, the question from Muriel. What are the most important steps governments should take to redirect consumer choices?
Well, one very important thing is that we get this labeling issue in place. And even though I say we shouldn't overestimate that effect, it's a necessity. We need to have that, and we need to have it in a uniform way across all products in all of Europe and in the most simple way possible. And that's achievable. I can think we can do it. I think that should be the first step.
Okay, perfect. Front of pack labeling. Jan, are you ready now to introduce Marco? And Marco, are you ready for the stage? Thank you so much, Klaus.
Okay, great. So then it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Marco Springmann. He's a senior researcher at Oxford University in the Center on Population Approaches for Non-Communicable Disease Prevention in the Nuffield Department of Population Health. And he leads also the center's program on environmental sustainability in public health. And if you read the scientific literature, you notice that Marco is a very active author of high-level scientific papers, and often the implications of his papers are provoking lively discussions. And so that's what we need for our session here. And so we look forward to the talk, which is called Tailoring Food Systems and Dietary Recommendations to Meet Public Health and Environmental Sustainability Goals. What does it take? So please, Marco, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and hello, everybody. Let's see that the slides come up. Well,
I think we changed the order and we made it complicated for the colleagues.
here we go, great. Let's see, that works. Okay, much of the background you are already familiar with now, especially after the morning session. Dietary risk are one of the biggest risk factors in the world, globally and in most regions. They are very costly to treat. If we look at diet-related diseases, up to 1.3 trillion estimated in 2030. And at the same time, the food system is woefully unsustainable. It's a major driver of climate change, land use and biodiversity loss, major user of freshwater resources, and a major polluter of terrestrial and aquatic systems. If we don't, without dietary changes, there is a massive risk of exceeding key planetary boundaries related to climate change, land use and biodiversity loss, water use, and biogeochemical flows of nitrogen and phosphorus. And the dietary changes we are talking about that are needed for us to collectively stay within those planetary boundaries are very drastic, like massive changes in the consumption of red meat, white meat, milk, and eggs, and massive reductions in those all across the world, in fact, also in low-income countries, which sometimes is not appreciated. Those are projections to 2030, though. And at the same time, massive increases in the consumption of healthier and more sustainable food commodities like fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds, and so on. So the magic question here is really, how do we incentivize the uptake of healthy and sustainable diets? And the literature on behavioral change seems to indicate, as we heard before from Klaus, there is no magic bullet. You probably need a multi-component integrative approach with several measures that include not only media and education campaigns, but also fiscal measures and possibly mandates and restrictions. In the following, I want to talk about one sort of fairly low-hanging fruit in some sense about an education measure that are national dietary guidelines. Like labeling, they are in a way just good housekeeping. So labeling you need for other food policies to come in place. Similarly, you need national dietary guidelines as the basis for other food policies to be implemented, at least if they are well thought through and well implemented in the policy domain in a country. Often when you talk about national food-based dietary guidelines, people think, oh, they are sort of scientific documents, where in fact it's clear that they are political documents, right? And I think that is very important to keep in mind. So that means, since they're political documents, they might not be as healthy or as sustainable that science would tell us they should be. So we wanted to analyze this and basically coded up all kinds of national dietary guidelines we got our hands with and ran them through an environmental and health analysis, both nationally and at the global level. For that, we used the FAO repository where countries can upload their national dietary guidelines. And we were able to code up 97. Not all of them were very understandable in some sense, and some data were missing. So in the end, we analyzed 85 of those. We supplemented that with global dietary guidelines as some benchmarks. So we took into account the WHO recommendations that you have heard about from Francesco this morning, as well as the Eat Lancet recommendations for healthy diets, healthy and sustainable diets. The first step in analyzing food-based dietary guidelines was to come up with a quantitative representation of those. And very often we found that lots of them were formulated in a super vague way. So we came up with this uncertainty coding to say, okay, if they provided an exact value, they had very high certainty in what they expressed or what the consumer maybe understands, so we gave it a 1. If it became more vague, like eat daily, and it was not really clear, it got a 3, and so on. We try to code some quantitative representation up for almost any of those to sort of be fair to those dietary recommendations. And then we applied that to baseline dietary consumption data. For the environmental analysis, we use country and crop-specific environmental footprints for greenhouse gas emissions, cropland use, freshwater use, and nitrogen and phosphorus application. The dietary health assessment was based on a comparative risk assessment framework similar to what the GBD is doing, but with non-overlapping risk factors, so we didn't get into that trouble. And lastly, to test not only what the adoption of national dietary guidelines could do in that country, we also wanted to have a more, let's say, objective measure of whether those dietary guidelines are actually in line with global sustainability and health targets. Why do we need that? Well, it could be that, let's say, adoption of dietary guidelines in the UK or in the US would reduce greenhouse gas emissions by, let's say, 17%, in India maybe 10%. However, baseline consumption is so different, so globally adopting those diets might indicate whether those dietary guidelines are actually in line with those goals and whether you would outsource responsibility to change diets more to other countries. And for that, we translated basically the planetary boundary framework to or mapped the planetary boundary framework to the SDGs. So let's jump into the first results here. Here you see the overall uncertainty score. That doesn't mean anything about whether those guidelines are any good or not, but it tells you how concrete guidelines were. As you can see here, guidelines, for example, in the US were fairly detailed in providing what they think a healthy diet is, whereas guidelines in Brazil or Canada that are sometimes praised for their nice pictures and emphasis on processed foods were actually not very detailed on the quantitative side at all. Europe, as you can see, was not so bad. As a region, it was actually leading. And if you look at which food groups had the clearest recommendations, those were fruit and vegetables, probably the things that the general public also would recall most of if you prompted them. And the least concrete recommendations were for things like processed meat. Red meat wasn't very high up on the agenda either. And attaining a healthy energy balance was also sometimes not mentioned at all. Surprisingly here, maybe if you look at the global dietary guidelines, is that the WHO, even though they are tasked to sort of provide some guidance on healthy diets, actually doesn't provide many concrete recommendations at all. They have a document that outlines a balanced energy intake. They do recommend, they do have a sugar target and a fruit-veg target, and they sort of have more vague recommendations on whole grain and processed meat that just suggests sort of moderate consumption in the case of processed meat. Whereas the Eat Lancet recommendations, they have recommendations on all of those major food groups that we looked at. What do those recommendations entail? Well, sort of what you would expect. So more legumes, more whole grains, more milk, mostly driven by recommendations in the Near East. More fish, more nuts and seeds, more fruits and veg, less red meat, less sugar, and so on. So in general, you might think, well, they go to the right direction. And sure enough, when we run that through the health analysis, we see that on average, adoption of those national food-based dietary guidelines would reduce premature mortality by roughly 15% in the countries that have those guidelines. Here you see from where those would come. A bit less than half would be from maintaining a balanced energy intake level and therefore having less overweight and obesity, whereas a bit more than half would come from changes in dietary composition, meaning more fruits and veg, less red meat, more legumes, more nuts and seeds. Interestingly here, what you can also see is that the national food-based dietary guidelines have a very similar health impact as the WHO guidelines, even though they're a bit less detailed, but they focus on the key aspects here. Whereas the Eat Lancet recommendations, because they are so much more comprehensive, have about a third higher or greater impact in reducing premature mortality, all across the board if you look at the different regions. Here are the results for greenhouse gas emissions. Because most of the dietary guidelines recommend reductions in meat and dairy, only in meat consumption, you have a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in most countries. If you look at the full results, and that is a bit hard to eyeball here, on average, the greenhouse gas reductions are about 15%. However, again, if you compare that to the more progressive Eat Lancet recommendations, that goes up to over 40%. And you again have a bit of an outlier here with the Near East that recommends crazy high consumption of dairy and therefore has an increase in most of those resource use indicators. Now, what does that mean for global sustainability? As I said, reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in a country of 10, 15, 20% might not mean very much if baseline consumption levels are fairly off the mark. And indeed, that is what we found. So this slide is, I think, the key slide that shows you how many of the global sustainability and health targets would be attained if people move to their national dietary guidelines, and if you took those national dietary guidelines as a global marker. So as an example would be, okay, what would happen if everybody in the UK, if everybody in the world ate like the UK government recommends, right? Would we be able to meet the sustainable development goals related to food and health? And the answer is here, 98% of all food-based dietary guidelines actually did not meet at least one of those global health and sustainability targets. And 2/3 only met one or two. So often it was the health target because they're targeted on health, and maybe the phosphorus target, but on most others they really failed. And here you can see how much they failed. So it's usually the greenhouse gas emissions that are the critical issue here. How to interpret this? Again, maybe let's focus on the big one, North American national dietary guidelines. So if everybody ate like North American guidelines suggest, we basically would need 4 Earths to dilute the food-related greenhouse gas emissions enough, all other sectors equal, to not have runaway climate change. So this is very dramatic, and as you can see here, is really, again, only the Eat Lancet diets that you can say, well, they were constructed like that they stay within environmental limits. But you can see it's kind of shocking that all of those different national food-based dietary guidelines in those regions didn't meet those fairly basic targets. And here you can see what the reason is, right? So you see lots of dark red and blue. So that is beef, lamb, and dairy. That alone, the intake of those commodities is enough to basically fill 2 Earths full of food-related greenhouse gas emissions. And I should say this is already better than the baseline, right? And the baseline, that would be 1 Earth more basically that would be needed. But as you can see, the recommendations are not progressive enough, especially on animal source foods, to be in line with global sustainable and health goals. The takeaway message from this is really much that guidelines are needed and they inform other national policies. Most of them are not sustainable when globally adopted, so they offload responsibility to other countries to basically change diets or intend to change diets more. The reason is lack of progressive recommendations that can be health informed on animal source products, and updating those would be really a first point of action. The Eat Lancet recommendations could be a good starting point. They don't need to be the only point. I think what is important here is to stress that it's important to provide concrete examples, but not prescribe like one specific dietary pattern, but a plethora of different diets that would be in line with both health and sustainability targets. So for example, having flexitarian, pescatarian, vegetarian, vegan dietary patterns, and some national dietary guidelines already make efforts on this. Of course, updating dietary guidelines, despite the fact that I think is a very necessary step, is really not all. And here you can see how many countries meet actually their own dietary guidelines, and it looks rather bad. So hardly any country follows what is recommended nationally. That also means once you develop national dietary guidelines, there really needs to be more investment in public health promotion programs. And those could, if you value the potential savings in diet-related mortality, basically any health promotion program that costs less than 50% of national GDP would be cost-effective in helping people change their food consumption patterns. So there is really a total inadequacy of following up national dietary guidelines with proper programs. What could those programs look like? Many of them might not actually cost anything if designed well, but an important thing are here fiscal measures. And I want to leave you with an impression of what could be done here. So in the past, we run through analysis on a couple of those and looked at what would happen if you priced in climate damage costs into the prices of foods. That could have a significant impact of reducing, especially the consumption of animal source foods. And if designed well, you can make them such that they would always result in a health and environmental benefit, also in low-income countries, even if you adjust the tax base and you make sure that revenues are recycled to the consumer and low-income households are compensated. You can also approach this from the perspective of health and price in healthcare costs associated with overconsumption of certain foods in their prices, and we calculated how much more red meat and unprocessed red meat and processed red meat would cost. In Europe, for example, that was 30% more, at least for unprocessed red meat, and over 100%, so double its price for processed red meat. Doing that would make healthy and sustainable dietary patterns cheaper. They are already cheaper if you look at the cost of basic food commodities in high-income and upper-middle-income countries. But doing this integration of food system externalities like climate damages and health would indeed help to make healthier and more sustainable dietary patterns that are most of the time more plant-based a more attractive option and result in quite a big saving for households if they chose to go towards those dietary patterns. Lastly, but not least, is reform of agricultural subsidies, which are urgently needed. Many of the current agricultural subsidies are not used to grow healthy and sustainable foods. Many don't prescribe what to grow with, but I think now we are at a stage where we really need a massive transformation of food systems in order to produce the healthy and sustainable diets that we really need to move towards. And that also means we really need to think about coupling stronger the provision of agricultural subsidies to the production of healthy and sustainable food commodities. And we ran through some concrete examples in our studies. So to wrap up, I think it's clear that if we don't do anything and we just let sort of the market run as it's run without much regulation, we are doomed for disaster. Environmental resource use and pollution could increase anywhere between 50 and 90%, and basically exceed all planetary boundaries that we know of by 2050, and therefore put key ecosystems at risk. So in order to avoid that, we really need progressive regulation, reformulation of national food-based dietary guidelines, follow-up with proper public health promotion campaigns, and fiscal and other measures. And I hope the country-level results of those studies that are showcased here can help in creating some of the strategies in each country to move towards healthy and sustainable food systems. So if you're interested in any of those, please check them out. The supplementary data has all the details for every country. And those are the references. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marco. Jan, do you want to?
Yes, I take over. Okay,
Yeah.
so I also wanted to thank Marco also for his conclusions. And before you showed these conclusions, you got two very challenging questions in my view. I get them both to you, so maybe you can maybe try and answer them both. So one is, as for the incentives, so for Matthias, as for the incentives, do you think sustainable and healthy diets could be encouraged through some sort of social credit system that rewards consumers for making sustainable and healthy food choices? Participation would be voluntary and there would be no sanctions, just rewards. And the second question from Nora is, I wonder if you think industry lobbying should be forbidden in the creation of national dietary guidelines, like, for example, was done in Canada, which then led to not having a dairy section, for example.
Yeah, great suggestions, really. I like the idea of the first. I wonder where the money for the rewards would come from. So I guess if you want something like that, you need to also balance it with, I don't know, taxing unhealthy and unsustainable foods more. But in general, I think, you know, playing with carrots and sticks has some leeway to it. So, and if you do it in a playful way, I think that might be worth giving a shot. The second one, yeah, I do believe strongly that the food industry should not have a say in food-based dietary guidelines. I think this should be a science-based endeavor. In order to make them work and encourage uptake, you obviously need also a good stakeholder engagement program. So I think there needs to be outreach and there needs to be a big tent approach. But in the first development, they should really be science-based. So I think that is a prerogative, really, a priority.
Jan, in the moderated questions, we have Anne's question back. Marco, I think you answered, but just in case you want to add something. So Anne is asking if you know, we were to internalize all the externalities that you've discussed, how can we calculate this real price? Do you want to add something?
Sure. So for some of those externalities, we already have okay data. I mean, one can always complain about data, but we quantified, for example, the climate damage costs. So that is done through something called the social cost of carbon. Has a lot of uncertainties, but there is a number that can be used, and science will work towards updating that and making it more grounded, I would say. But this can be done already. With the health costs, that can be done too. There are standard ways of valuing the health costs associated with unhealthy diets. But there are, of course, many more externalities, like air pollution through the application of fertilizers on fields, loss of ecosystem services, loss of biodiversity, also antimicrobial resistance and the health costs associated with that in humans as an indirect way, and infectious disease outbreaks. So there are lots of things that need to be or can be valued and should be valued and maybe be reflected in the full cost of foods. And there are several initiatives going on that work towards that, including our own research. So I'll just say stay tuned.
Thank you very much. Jan, if you agree, we wrap up now, and then there's still also a question from Carlota, but maybe we can come back to it during the panel. Thank you so much, Marco. And I'll leave you the floor again, Jan, if you want to introduce Lucia.
Yes, thank you. So, in fact, I introduced our last speaker and I asked her for her name. So it's actually Lucia Reisch. She is a professor for behavioral economics and policy at the University of Cambridge. She is a behavioral economics and social scientist, and she is one of Europe's leading academic experts when it comes to behavioral insight-based policies for sustainability. And with that, basically, it's almost directly leading to the title of her talk. its policy options to transform food systems and food consumption patterns. And please, Lucia, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, and thanks for having me. So it's actually the third talk, which sometimes overlaps a little bit with the two earlier talks, but I do think I can do some deep dives here and now, so please bear with me. Actually, talking about dietary guidelines is really interesting. So I really enjoyed Marco Springmann's talk. So if the next slide would come. Do you see it? I don't. Uh-oh.
We see the first slide.
It's my first slide, but I want to go to the, yes, here we go. Okay, thank you. So talking about dietary guidelines, this is actually the one from Denmark, the place where I spent the last 20 years at. And I think I want to show it because there's kind of, there's hope. There's hope out there. There is some optimism because some countries actually are now systematically including the climate health nexus and kind of making explicit, and that's targeted also towards consumers to eat less meat and choose legumes and fish. So there are some more innovative governments who are already kind of on the right track. Particularly also fish is actually pretty complicated because there's also recent studies showing that it very much depends on where you recommend eating more fish, because that also often means farmed fish, and that has an impact on land use, and that has an impact on biodiversity, which more or less takes us directly into how difficult it is to communicate with and towards the consumer, as we have already heard before. So if we know, and also if consumers know, and I think it's pretty difficult to not to know these days, even just looking at the news and being exposed to media, why is it then so difficult to change behavior and to do what those dietary guidelines recommend? So eat more fish, eat less meat, have a more plant-based diet. And we already heard from Klaus, the MOA model, which is kind of at the heart of our understanding of consumer behavior. Let me just add some aspects to that. Klaus already introduced the system 1, system 2 thinking. So basically, we know today that consumers are not rational beings, but are heavily influenced by biases, by heuristics, and by the context. So one group of barriers to kind of, even if people want, so if the motivation is there, are all those kind of biases. And while I cannot go into depth, I would like to share a few of them. So present bias and endowment effect, we are very much creatures of habit. We like where we are, and changes are, particularly when it comes to diet, are really difficult. So you need quite strong incentives or strong nudges to actually get people move somewhere. Hyperbolic discounting is the fact that current losses loom much larger than anticipated gains, like health gains in the future, or greenhouse gas emissions and their impact in the future or somewhere else on this planet. So it's quite difficult for us to actually act on that knowledge, because it seems to be like somewhere happening in future land or somewhere else. And then also many of those consequences are actually pretty low salience. So as I said, like long-term health effects are pretty invisible in the short term and are below the sensing threshold, and same for climate or biodiversity loss. So, and we very much, it's kind of, we're wired into acting on things that we can smell, see, touch. It's quite difficult. I think that's probably my point here. So that's one group of barriers. Another one is something that the other speakers also touched upon, is that has to do with information and learning. learning thrives a lot on feedback. So we briefly had the discussion on should we use rewards or rather punishment. Missing immediate feedback on consequences is a big issue. So we have to think about how to actually add that, like with little feedback devices, for instance. And then there is a lot of consumer confusion, there's information overload, and there's also misinformation regarding those planetary health choices. And both unintended ones, just because there's too many labels or because there is a new study just coming out that it shows that Mediterranean diet that is always praised for being so healthy might be in some regions of the world rather critical because it impacts on biodiversity. So there's kind of a lot of confusion about what is really the best thing to do. And then also, of course, all kind of purposeful misinformation and kind of health washing, greenwashing that is out there very often because there's some commercial interest behind. And then there's this group of, probability. Let's make it. There's also a lot of still not very clear evidence on the attribution of climate and health impacts. So we know a lot today, and we are getting there. And resources are finally really spent on those questions, but we often deal with probabilistic harm. So there is an X% risk that Y happens. That's not very helpful for most consumers. We tend to like clear numbers and clear pathways. And then this is something, again, going back to the MOA model, opportunities. So context is absolutely key. So everything that has to do with affordances or signifiers in consumers' environment is of utmost importance. So how easy is it? How affordable is it? How acceptable is it? And all those immediate affordances do play a major role. We saw that from Klaus that we basically spend seconds to decide on food choices. There are, of course, many more, but these are the ones I want to focus on today. And this is also, I think, a kind of a nice overview, and I don't have to go into depth because the other speakers have done that already, but it basically shows how important context is. Again, availability, accessibility, and affordability of the food supply. And then also what is here called desirability. This is the big thing about taste, also something that has been put forward by Klaus. And this is also important, I think, because this is really about thinking about food systems. And my focus is usually on the individual consumers or on groups or large-scale consumers like canteens or schools. But it's, of course, always both. So it's the individual decision or the group decision embedded in the larger food system. And this is, of course, when you talk about policies, it's never either or, it's always both. And in particular, the interface and the fit between the two is of utmost importance. Again, when we talk about policies, we have to look at all the different policies. I want to focus on demand side policies. Why do I want to do that? First of all, because that's what I know most about. Second, there has been so much focus on supply side policies. Just looking at the IPCC reports of the last year, the most recent, the AR6, is the first one to actually cover a chapter specifically on demand side policies. And this is quite in advance, I think, because it basically says, yes, of course, it is so important about the supply side and the farmers and governmental actions, but it's also important to look at different options, how to change consumer behavior, specifically with demand side interventions. And again, it's impossible to go through all this. These are all the tools that are basically available these days. We talked briefly about regulation. Of course, very relevant because it does give the frame within which incentives can play out. We briefly talked about prices. This is what is behind taxes and subsidies. There's also sometimes forgotten lead market development or preferred vendor schemes for public procurement. So large-scale consumers are very, very important because there's not just they can really do something for market developments. Just thinking of like cell-based meat or alternative meats, they can do a lot just because of the scale, but also because of the scope and the endorsement and the model they provide. And then, of course, one of the topics I want to deep dive today is everything about choice architecture and behavioral insights, sometimes called nudges or nudge plus. I come back to those. And then also ideas about how to create new ways to produce co-production. And I think we also have to think a lot about urban food production and urban vertical farming, and particularly because that is happening in the cities, not somewhere outside. Consumers or consumer citizens have and should be part of that. Then we heard about defrauding, about labels, about transparency, and then also, particularly in the last talk, about what can education and advice actually do. And all of those, I mean, just to be sure, because I'm sometimes kind of accused of overselling behavioral approaches, not at all. We need all tools in the box. We need all hands on board, so to speak, because the challenge is simply too big. But let me now, this is why it's printed in bold, go a little bit deeper on nudges. I think most people probably know what I'm talking about. So kind of those small changes, usually in the environment, that help change consumer behavior without without having to wait until, for instance, values have been changed. I mean, we also have a big time issue here. I think some of the speakers also brought that up already. I like to use this it's a kind of dirty list. There's also nice scientific taxonomies. I call them the useful dozen. So these are examples of those little nudges. And just to stick with it, it's like 3 groups. The first one is about choice structure. The second one is about information about the choices. And the third group is all kind of assistance in choices. And again, I cannot go into depth with all of them. Let's just stick with defaults. And you see here Eric Adams, the mayor of New York. He actually is about to roll out a plant-based default scheme for hospitals and schools, and extend a lot on the idea that context is key, that the model, the modeling of plant-based food is really important, and that also children or also people in the hospital can thrive on good examples of what they're actually offered as default, a default diet, also because they spend quite a lot of time there. Yes, so when I talk about behavioral tools, that's not that new, actually. And I think today, after almost 2 decades of empirical research, we can kind of step back and have a look and say, what works, what doesn't work that well. We are in the stage where we can do meta-analysis. This is an example of a meta-analysis. We can do systematic reviews, and we can at least get some level of evidence, which is important to inform policymakers of what works, for whom, where, what are potential side effects, and how do those tools work compared to others. And this is just one example of colleagues of mine who looked into different effect sizes of different nudges. And what I probably want to show here is that, so size enhancement, that's a type of default, usually works pretty well. This is also why I think plant-based defaults and portion size defaults should play a major role in all kind of larger intervention programs. So defaults usually, on average, do work. They usually have quite large effects, high effectiveness, but at the same time, when they're made transparent and when people are explained what is going on and not kind of sneaky, they're also typically quite accepted. And they're kind of easy to do, affordable, and so they have a lot of there are a lot of good reasons why either canteens or cities or even nationwide dietary-based guidelines can think or should think of using plant-based defaults. That's another recent study to briefly share with you. We looked into specifically into defaults reducing meat consumption, and we saw overall that the main mechanism, so why does it work, is actually endorsement and also effort. Effort means, how if it's difficult or less difficult to opt out of the default. And of course, as always, there are some individual and contextual factors, how well that works. So for instance, in general, female participants tend to be more receptive and to change their behavior more than male. But that's just one observation. Yeah, I think I can skip that. So these were just some examples. I think that a very, very useful level of intervention, because that's the other question when I showed you this overview slide of the different policy options, these are mainly national policies. A lot is possible and works and is piloted on city level. So you might be aware of there's several initiatives. There's more than those using big cities, and this is where, soon the majority of worldwide will actually live and eat and make dietary decisions. There's a lot of good things one can do. And so again, sharing with you one of the current projects ongoing, so with the city of Copenhagen, but also the city of New York and a few others, we'll look into how do we actually do that? Which of those different policy tools can we apply to do two things, to reduce meat consumption and also to cut food waste? That has not really been in the focus today, but that always goes together. So please stay tuned and stay with us what we find out, how we can use those different type of nudges, particular plant-based defaults, to make a difference in those cities. So that's my final slide. As I said, after about 20 years of different experiments and survey work, a lot of empirical work that has gone into changing, using behavioral insights to change food behavior, we know a lot. Evidence base is growing, but there's still so many things we don't know that well, and we still have to understand better. And I just listed a few. There are probably more out there. So one of the things we have to understand better is how do the different food policies actually interact, because there are spillovers. We know that there is some crowding in, there is some crowding out, and it's often you really have to test it in the specific context, in the specific environment, in the specific country or city to find out, because it has a lot to do with how are the prices, the food culture, where people actually eat, who makes the food decisions. The second is which food policies complement each other most effectively. So it's also about the times, but also the timing. What works best when? How do we kind of create an ideal pool of policy, also time-wise? Then which food nudges work best for certain problems and for certain target groups? Here we do know a few things, but particularly we're specifically still not very knowledgeable when we leave our usual markets and when we go to the global south, for instance, when we look into immigrant groups, so they are still kind of terra incognita, more or less. It's also very important to look into unintended side effects because I said they are quite high on acceptance and effectiveness. But particularly, we talked about prices, and someone said the most important thing is to get the prices right. I agree as an economist, but at the same time, we have to be very, very aware what are the welfare effects, and particularly the welfare effects for the less well-off, or maybe even the least well-off. So here in the UK, there is this huge cost of living crisis, and prices are skyrocketing. And it's, as someone earlier pointed out this morning, it's a specific type of target group that is hit most. So there is a kind of a broader picture. And the question is how to compensate for those losses. Right, how to keep the consumers citizens in kind of in a positive mood and accept all kind of interventions. I do think this is very relevant. One thing that is now more kind of used is what some people call nudge plus. So it basically means get people to participate in the type of policies, particularly in a city that are used, and get their okay and approval on everything. Okay, I think this is what I wanted to share with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucia. Jan, we're a little bit short on time, but I'll leave it to you.
Yes, I see one question here in the chat, and maybe you see more, but maybe while I read it out, you can start preparing the panel discussion. So the question is from Camille. Communication on probabilistic harms towards consumers can be challenging, but is it not even made more complicated by the fact that some players having an interest in the status quo will often try and cast doubt on the scientific evidence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is part of the intentional mis or disinformation. And I mean, it's even a marketing strategy to confuse consumers so that in the end, they just take what is offered first or easily reachable in the stores, whatever. So that's definitely a big issue. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't see more questions in the chat, and I know maybe you want to start directly with the panel. Sandra?
Yes, I think that's probably the best, and the questions will come in the meantime. So I would like to invite to stage Sylvia again, of course, Marco and Klaus. Lucia will be with us online, and so will Jan. Do we have? Yes.
Thank you, Sandra. Let's see whether I have the mic in place. Is it working? Yes, you can hear me. Okay. So thank you very much to all the speakers. I just learned a lot in this last hour, I must say. To start the discussion, I will ask Marco. We have food-based guidelines for a long time. Just people don't follow. So even if we change them to be healthier and more sustainable, what would be the gain of it? This is a provocative question.
Can I tell? I need to.
Yes, please.
Check. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is they are developed in some, health department and then put in some folder and locked away. And there is really limited follow-up in terms of other policies that, in theory, should be based on those. So I think having better policy integration and really policy follow-up and investment in those national food-based diet guidelines.
So the main use could be to tailor policy to them, to use them to tailor policy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And they give justification for policies that would move national consumption patterns closer to those, right?
So this is a message for member states, if there are any representatives in the room now. But following to that, I will turn to Klaus and say, well, yes, we have food-based eating guidelines for a long time, but we know how difficult is switching dietary habits for adults. Is this possible that we have more room for maneuver with the youngest? So whether, for example, schools and nutrition education at schools would have higher chances of building dietary habits that are healthier and more sustainable for the future.
Yeah, I think it's, we know pretty well that habits change most easily in times of transition. When you are very young, of course, your food-related behaviors are mostly influenced by your parents, so there is no disruption there. But as soon as you become a teenager and start sort of going away from your parents, it's one of those transitions where there is room and possibility for changes in habits. And it's clear that the school has a big role there, and that the peer influence is something that can be worked with. It's one of the opportunities, yes.
Lucia, I just extend the question to you in case you have something to add to this.
Sure, how to change behavior. I mean, definitely. I mean, as it's so windows of transition are of more broader life stages, changes like moving out of the house or like students here coming to college. I mean, these are really major opportunities because so many values and habits get challenged, and having a supportive environment that is really dedicated to support those new and urgently needed new dietary habits is certainly supportive. But it's quite a big thing. I mean, even here in this in college, we're trying really hard to kind of introduce those plant-based defaults, and we do meet all kind of status quo, but also some just questions of skill. I mean, it's not talking about desirability and taste. It's not just that you change a whole delivery system in a month, but you need people who actually can do that, who are knowledgeable. So I think also it's not just educating the consumer, the individual consumer or the student. It's really about the whole delivery system and also kind of the system of provision. So cooks and people who do the procurement and the vendors and the intermediaries. I think so all those intermediaries are also really important targets.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm going to take now one question from the chat, Carlota Tarofila, and it's a question for Marco. So dietary shift is seen sometime as giving up for our culinary traditions. From the name, I understand is an Italian person asking this question. How can we align this with more sustainable food system needs?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think in this whole field of looking at food, sustainable food systems and diets, sometimes this culinary aspect falls a bit short. But for example, the Eat Lancet guidelines, they're very much in line with all kinds of culinary tradition. You can make a traditional Mediterranean diet out of it. You can make a sort of Okinawa Japanese diet out of it. You can have a vegan Adventist diet out of it. So very often those culinary traditions are more about how you spice things and how you prepare things, but the ingredients are all there. So if you just follow take the guidelines as telling you what the overall proportion of foods are, then you can apply any culinary tradition to those.
So you think they are flexible enough to embrace all cultures and traditions and allow for that flexibility?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one can obviously say, well, what about, sometimes that question comes up to sort of barbecue traditions in Latin American countries, right? And I mean, there I would say those are also fairly recent traditions, right? So lots of this high meat consumption came up after Second World War, really, right? So one can also challenge that. Well, what traditions should really be preserved?
50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years.
Exactly. I mean, we have always changed what we eat, right? And I think coming up with something that preserves the social aspect of eating whilst having something healthy and sustainable is very important.
Right. I will follow with a question from the chat. Fernando Rivero Pino to Klaus. How can authorities communicate these messages about sustainability to consumers if it's clear that labeling is not a useful tool right now? If I can elaborate on that, it just came to my mind when listening to your presentations. What about labeling the climate tax? If a climate tax is put on food in the end, what about labeling that?
What about what?
Labeling whatever tax is put on foods in relation to climate.
First of all, I think it's important that information can have different functions, because labeling, the function of labeling is to distinguish between different products, and in this way help people making choices.
Right.
That is a different, labeling by itself has only a limited function probably in making people aware of that there is an issue, which I think is what the question is about. I think most people have heard that there is a climate change issue. Not everybody may agree about the seriousness, but I think most people have heard about that. That the climate change issue is linked to food is maybe a bit newer than the whole climate debate, but I think most people have heard that as well. So it's maybe not there where the biggest problem is. There is a problem in what I showed in one of my last slides, namely that people may think it doesn't affect me because I'm already making the right choices. My diet is sort of pretty healthy and pretty sustainable. And I think it's very important, but I think I'm already doing what I can do. That is an issue. And here we're talking about a third type of information, namely how can we give people feedback on the healthiness and sustainability of their choices. That, I think, as I've mentioned it briefly in the talk, I think that's an area where we really can do something by providing ways of giving people feedback on their choices. And for example, some retailers have started to do something. If you use their app to buy products in their stores, they can give you feedback about the environmental impact of your choices. I think that's one way which is interesting.
Because I understand feedback to be effective needs to be immediate, not maybe what Lucia was talking about. You know, if you talk about healthy choices of which you're going to see the impact in a very long time, people may not be so sensitive. To, you know, this long-term reward is very far away from us, but an immediate reward you think is going to be much more effective.
Yeah, well, you can give feedback at different levels. The most effective is individual immediate feedback, right? But if that is not possible, you can give feedback at the aggregate level. For example, at the level of the country and saying about the food choices here, Denmark, where I live, have the following impact on the planet. It's not quite as effective, but it's also good.
Right. Looking at the time,
Can I?
Sandra, yes, of course.
Just thinking about, also the scope of our session. And in that respect, I need to thank Lucia, because she had this slide where she had, what do we need to understand better? What are the next steps in terms of science and research and so on? And I saw there a message for academia. And what I perceived from our session was that there were many messages for policymakers, for governments. Maybe it's also my own bias, because these are the people that I work with, so it's the messages that I retain the most. But I wonder if you have other messages for the other groups that we wanted to target also with this session, which were, for example, academic, risk assessors, food business operators. So is there something else that you want to tell to these people that maybe are here or online and that are listening?
Yeah, that's a great prompt. I think what comes out, at least from the health and sustainability nexus, is that dietary composition is really the key thing. So you can think about X ways of sort of producing meat differently, for example, or eating and changing agriculture practices. But in the end, everything boils down to what is in your diet and to what degree. So that means for retailers, it's essential to monitor their portfolio. For companies, it is essential to monitor their portfolio. And for consumers, it's essential to monitor their dietary composition, you know? So on all of those things, that trumps everything else. So, you know, if you're just looking at an aspect that doesn't pertain to dietary composition, you really need to add this.
Yeah, well, I have mentioned some implications for the food chain actors. I think new product development is extremely important in order to create a better array of products on the market. I have mentioned the pricing thing. Most companies these days, both manufacturers and retailers, have some sustainability policy. What does follow from that? Sometimes it's related to their product development. It could also be related to their pricing policies. I think that's an obvious link that I think is not pursued a lot. So I think that's a really important point. For academia, of course, there are lots of things. In my own area, one thing that we know not enough about is sort of the long-term changes. A lot of the things, also what Lucia showed, is very interesting, but it's mostly about short-term effects on changing consumers' choices. What can we do to make these stable so that they become habitualized? So that is what people naturally do and not need to be nudged to do every time.
Mm-hmm. Maybe Lucia wants to add something.
Yes, thank you. I mean, thinking of, I think I want to make a point to the businesses out there. I think there is a big business case also, because, I mean, we will see tougher regulation. There will be a CO2 tax also on food. There's quite some interest, and I think also business case in like cell-based meat, for instance. There's so many things are actually coming together. We started this morning with looking at the different crises that are now culminating and all coming together. I mean, thinking of fertilizer and crops that are missing on the world market. So thinking of product development that do not need those crops for development, but really also alternative products, I think that's quite a business case. And then also maybe towards businesses, I think there's also time to involve the consumer more via the kind of direct interface, such as, you know, like digital, Klaus just mentioned apps. And there are some really nice pilots out there that use those apps, not just to inform the consumer, but also to reward him or her, for instance, with, you know, like payback points related to a climate conscious diet. There are so many ways out there, and I think it's really, really time to change the business model and to look much more further ahead and taking all those big changes that are now on the horizon really serious.
Thank you all for this discussion. And now, looking at the time, yes, I'm going to give the floor to Sandra and Jan for the final remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylvia. Thank you very much for the great panel. Thank you to all of you also. Jan, do you want to share some thoughts before we go, or?
Yes, but very briefly, because I think we had so rich talks and discussions that it's very difficult, you know, to make some concluding words, to just leave them. I think, you know, in the whole morning we have heard it's clearly the case now for the need to a transitioning to a sustainable food system, which can only happen with a transition to sustainable and healthy diets. I think the case was made. I think we have also heard a lot, you know, the importance how the consumer is involved, about consumer trust. We have heard a lot. I think very interesting was also the nudge plus, you know, that I haven't heard before, trying to have citizens and consumers having their buy-in, you know, so that they agree basically with the direction we want to go. I also like that Jessica Fanzo mentioned the farmers that need support in these transitions, although we spoke here about diets and consumers. They were not forgotten either. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of food for thought. I just leave here some keywords that, for me, I wrote down in capital letters. I don't know, maybe Sandra, you want to add anything, or?
No, I will not dare, to be honest. It's, as you say, there's a lot of healthy and sustainable food for thought, and let's hope that together we can make it available to everywhere and to every one of us. So before we go, I need to invite those that wish to join Klaus and Francesco. They will be available for a virtual meeting after this session. I think you can find the details in the app. I also need to remind everyone that wishes to join back at 2. The sessions will continue. And I also wanted to ask again for a round of applause, not only to our wonderful speakers, to our audience, also to our technical team, because this went really smoothly. It wasn't easy, but we had participants in all kinds of ways, and we managed. So thank you very much.